I don't see that the concept of race should be any more. The term they love to use in social science is problematize. You should problematize a category, and the way you can kind of convey your intelligence and your wisdom and your profundity is by in a very long-winded way problematizing everything by saying you're dealing with someone who's a bit of a poser if they say, well, what do we mean by whatever word that everyone knows the meaning of in the dictionary that there is? I mean, that's when you know that you're in a humanities department at a university. But race is, I mean, it's no more bizarre than sex or differentiating between species or whatever. A species is normally defined as separated from another species by the virtue of the fact that it can't have fertile offspring. So you're in the same species if you can produce fertile offspring. Now, there are certain, in any series of categories that you might care to break the world down with, there's going to be certain things that are on the board that don't quite match. Sometimes we say that this thing is a different species from this, even though they can produce fertile offspring, or sometimes, I'd like to see a Great Dane produce fertile offspring with a Chihuahua. But maybe that's happened. I don't know. But this is it. I mean, from the postmodern perspective, we can't understand anything at all, and it's totally impractical. You can't live like that, and they don't live like that. From a practical perspective, you have to be able to divide the world up into a series of categories that allow correct predictions to be made, and that is the test of a scientific category. That although there's going to be things that are borderline and don't quite fit or whatever, does it allow correct predictions to be made? That's it. And if it does, then it's a meaningful category. And if it allows lots of correct predictions to be made, if there's all these predictions that can be made and they're all in the same direction, then obviously it's a very useful category indeed with regard to negotiating life. And that's what race is. When we talk about race, what we mean is basically genetic clusters. We're talking about different groups which differ in the frequency of certain genes. That's it. Now, that division is worth making because these groups that differ in the frequency of certain genes, there are all kinds of correlates that go with differing in the frequency of those certain genes in terms of what they look like, in terms of how intelligent they are, in terms of the kind of average personality they have, in terms of the kind of diseases to which they are susceptible, in terms of all these different things. And that is why it becomes useful to correct predictions can be made on many levels in terms of race. A good example of this is if you were a doctor. If you talk to any doctor about this, doctors are on the front line, as it were, dealing with humanity. Doctors tend to believe in the concept of race, and doctors tend to believe in the concept of race because they know perfectly well that, for example, some medicines, a black person will need a higher dose than a white person. I mean, this is a fact, to the extent that if you give the black person the same dose that you give a white person, you could seriously hurt or kill them. So it has meaning in real life. If you want to abolish the concept of race, it could be argued, you basically want people of certain races in the medical context to die, because that is the consequence of not understanding. If you were in a situation where you had to give a blood transfusion and you didn't know what the person's blood type was, and you had to make a guess, then race would be a good proxy, or at least certain races. Whether, let's say, they were Native American, you could make an educated guess as to what blood type they were likely to be. So race becomes a useful because of the prevalence of certain blood types in certain races. So that's all race is. Races are these genetic clusters that have been separated by a number of things, separated by geographically. Maybe they've separated themselves. They've separated through endogamy, through just breeding with other people that are like them for religious reasons or whatever. And this is how you end up with these differences. If they're geographical differences, then they've been subject to a different ecology, so you end up with differential levels of Darwinian selection for different traits or whatever. And there are other effects as well that can be relevant: founder effect, genetic drift, this sort of thing. But this is the adaptation of this. Now, in terms of the data, the genetic assay data we've got, it's been found that there's somewhere between the region of 10 and 12 separate genetic clusters that are all kind of that can be clearly distinguished, based on the analysis. And interestingly, these 10 to 12 genetic clusters are pretty much the same as the 12 races of classical anthropology. So what this tells you is that our instinctive, our stereotypical, if you like, understanding of race, based simply on our observation and our instinct that something is different, does indeed have empirical accuracy, because it is pretty much the same as what these genetic clusters are telling us. So that's race. And it really shouldn't be a problematic concept for anybody. I mean, if any concept is, if all concepts are problematic, I argue that's an inconsistent position. You can't live like that. And if you're not going to accept that, then race shouldn't be a problematic thing at all. We can certainly argue that there are 5 races. That is Europeans, Sub-Saharan Africans, East Asians, American Indians, and Aborigines, Australians. That's quite clear. And we can. It seems there's a pretty good case for arguing we can go further to 10 or even 12. So yeah, so there's 10 to 12, depending on which analysis you look at. I mean, Calabi-Sforza and his colleagues in 1994, they looked at 120 alleles for 42 populations, and they ended up with these genetic linkage trees, which allowed them to calculate 10 distinct clear clusters, right? Bushmen and Pygmies, Sub-Saharan Africans, South Asians and North Africans, Europeans, Northeast Asians, Arctic peoples, Native American Indians, Southeast Asians, Pacific Islanders, and Australian Aborigines and Aboriginal New Guineans. So you have 10. And there is at least a case for distinguishing between North Africans and South Asians and distinguishing between Bushmen and Pygmies. Do that, you have 12. And those are the 12 races of classical anthropology. As I say, you've got race differences on all kinds of illnesses, cystic fibrosis, for example. There's race differences in that. You can see that among Europeans, cystic fibrosis is much higher than among Africans. There's all kinds of other genetic conditions consistent with it being genetic where this is the case. Now, the criticisms of the concept of race itself are, in my view, very, very unconvincing. They are pretty much things like this. First of all, it's a problematic concept because it's got a history of racism associated with it. It's a Western concept, and it's related to imposition and power and privilege and all this kind of thing. To which one can say, well, hang on a minute. I mean, that's true of any word. Any word in the English language is Western and is rooted in history and whatever. So what? Central question is it a predictive category? A second argument is it can mean different things. So race has been used historically as we would now use the word ethnicity. People talk about the English race or whatever. So what? Words change their meanings over time. I mean, the word gay used to mean happy, and the word gay now means homosexual. Does that mean that the concept of a homosexual can't be used? I mean, that's insane. So that's the second argument. It's pretty rather desperate, really. Also, these kinds of arguments could be levelled against any taxonomy. Any word, any concept comes from somewhere. So it really is a rather silly argument. I don't really understand what on earth they're talking about most of the time. A third argument is to say, there's tiny differences between races. The differences genetically are very, very small. Well, so what? The difference between a Mozart and a bog standard musician is going to be small. It doesn't mean that making that kind of division doesn't allow correct predictions to be made. A fourth idea is that it leads to bad consequences. It legitimizes racist groups and whatever. So what? That has no bearing on whether or not it's a predictive category. This conflation which people that have maybe only slightly above average IQ seem to often make between values and truth. They're not intelligent enough to be able to distinguish between the two things. So if you say to me, I'm left-handed, as perhaps you've noticed from having this interview so far, if you say to me, left-handed people have a lower average IQ than right-handed people, well, it's ridiculous for me to be offended by that. It's just a fact. It's also a fact that people that have outlier high IQ, really, really high IQ, are very substantially left-handed. That's also a fact. And if you're right-handed, then you shouldn't be offended by that. I mean, it's not about it's just childlike. So we'll dispatch that one to the outer darkness as well. Another criticism is this insane idea which comes up again and again and again, and it makes me want to bang my head against the wall until blood comes out of my eyes. Which is that there are more differences within races than between them. Well, there are more differences within humanity than there are between humanity and chimpanzees. Now, I mean, that doesn't mean that it's not meaningful in terms of making correct predictions to distinguish between humanity and chimpanzees. And if you think it's not meaningful, if you, postmodern watcher of this, if there are any, think it's not meaningful, You go and spend a week living in, I don't know, Dorchester in Dorset, and then you go and spend a week living with a group of chimpanzees, and you tell me which one you prefer. I mean, for God's sake. And equally, even if the differences are only small, even if they are only small, that doesn't say anything about the nature of the differences. If there are a very small number of differences between you and I psychologically, but they all go in the same direction, they all push in the same direction, then this will mean that if there's a very small number of differences between, let's say, England and America, but they all push these differences in the same direction, you're going to end up with a very different kind of society, even if the number of differences are small. And in much the same way, if there are a lot of differences between me and our society and some other society, but they're kind of at random, then actually the difference in what life will be like will actually be probably smaller. So the arguments that ultimately what the argument it comes down to, their trump card, if you like, is to just say, look, it's unthinkable. It's unthinkable. And if you think this, then you're not part of my group, and you're a bad person, and you're racist, racist, racist. And this word is this highly emotional, indefinite word, which historically meant a person who believes that their race is superior to another race or something like that, but has now essentially come to mean people who disagree with the current dispensation in any way. And so it's just this open-ended manipulative term, which doesn't really have any proper definition, and it's really about an assertion of power and about a way of emotionally browbeating somebody through associating them with evil into conformity, and making clear to those who might think about not conforming that this is what will happen if you don't conform. Yes. We will smear you with this highly emotive term. So you'd better watch out. So it's no argument. I mean, it's just a manipulative, fallacious form of reasoning. So as far as I can see, race is a perfectly sensible scientific category, and I'd be very, very skeptical of people who disagree with that. They are either disagreeing because they are ideologically motivated, and they just don't like the idea of racial differences because they believe in equality or some such dogma, right. Or they're basically cowards and they want to be able to have their cake and eat it, so they replace the word race with cluster or heritage or some other euphemism that basically means exactly the same thing. If it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, shoot it.
Indeed. But all right, so coming back to that question